The chamber was already voting when I walked in. I could hear it, that low, rhythmic hum the conclave used for formal ratification. 7 species, 230 delegates, and not one of them looked at me as I took my seat at the defendant's table. They had already decided. The hum was just ceremony. My name is HFY. I was 34 years old when Earth was erased from the map of the known galaxy, and I was the last human being to speak before it happened. The conclave's chamber was enormous. A hollow sphere carved from the core of Citadel Station, with delegate platforms arrayed in concentric rings around a central void. Gravity was artificial and pointed inward, so every species sat on the inner surface of the sphere, all facing each other, all equal in position if not in power. The Varathi had designed it that way, 2,000 years ago, when they founded the conclave. They were proud of that design. Equal sight lines for all. A perfect circle of shared governance. What they never mentioned was that only one species had ever called a severance order, theirs. The elder Sethka floated at the center of the void on a gravity platform, his robes moving slowly in the recycled air. He was ancient, the Varathi measured age in centuries, and his skin had that deep amber translucence that came with 5 or 6 of them. His 6 eyes were half closed. He had the expression of someone performing a task that did not require their full attention. He was reading the charge sheet. I had heard it before. 3 years of hearings had made it as familiar to me as my own name. Ecological recklessness. Unregulated expansion into unclaimed corridors, failure to submit to mandatory population review, and the one they kept returning to, the one that sat at the center of everything like a stone in still water. Cultural contamination of pre-contact civilizations. That last one was the real charge. The others were just the frame they built around it. What had actually happened was this. We had spoken to the Dravathi without permission. The Dravathi were a small, quiet species in the outer spiral arm, 4 light-years past the edge of conclave-mapped space. They were not members of the conclave. They were not under any formal protection order. They were simply a species the conclave had catalogued and then chosen to leave alone. Which meant, in practical terms, chosen to keep alone. We hadn't known that, or rather, we had suspected it and we'd made contact anyway, because 2 human explorers in a scout vessel had detected a distress signal and responded to it. That was the kind of thing humans did. We heard someone in trouble and we went. The Dravathi hadn't been in trouble, as it turned out. The signal was a navigational beacon that had malfunctioned. But we had already been in their space, already transmitted greetings, already shared a meal equivalent through the translator protocols. We had given them star charts, actual, honest star charts, that showed the full extent of charted space, including regions the conclave had told them were empty. They were not empty. The conclave had spent 40 years quietly strip mining 3 of the systems shown on those charts. That was what this trial was really about. Not our recklessness, not our expansion. It was about the fact that we had, by accident and good faith, shown a subjugated species something the conclave did not want them to see. Sethka finished the charge sheet and let the silence settle. He was good at silence. The Varathi used it the way humans use punctuation. Then he read the ruling. Severance Order, Class 1. Permanent removal of Earth and all Terran-designated bodies from conclave trade networks. Termination of communication relay access. Establishment of a monitoring perimeter at the boundary of the Sol system, maintained by conclave sentinel drones. No Terran vessel to pass the perimeter without explicit conclave authorization, which would not be granted. Duration of order, indefinite, subject to review at the conclave's discretion, which in practical terms meant never. Humanity was being locked in its room. I had been given the right to address the chamber before the order was formally sealed. It was a formality. Everyone in that sphere knew it was a formality, including me. But I had prepared something anyway, because I was human, and humans do not waste the last word. I stood up slowly. I smoothed my jacket. I looked at Sethka across the empty air of the void between us, and I let myself take one full breath before I spoke. I did not make an argument. I had made arguments for 3 years. They had been received politely, acknowledged formally, and then set aside. I did not beg. That was never something I was going to do. And the conclave would not have respected it anyway. I did not threaten. Threats required leverage, and on paper, at that moment, we had none. What I did was look at Sethka directly without lowering my eyes, and I smiled, not a polite smile, not a diplomatic smile, the kind of smile that comes from somewhere deep and certain, from a place that already knows the end of the story, even if it cannot yet say it aloud. And then I said quietly and clearly into the chamber's perfect acoustics, "Perfect, watch this." The chamber was very still for a moment. Sethka studied me with all 6 eyes. Whatever he was looking for in my face, I do not think he found it, because what he was looking for was collapse. Grief maybe, anger definitely. The Varathi understood anger. It confirmed their assessment of us, volatile, unpredictable, dangerous. What they did not have a category for was calm. He sealed the order. 2 conclave security officers, Makari tall and blue-gray, in their formal plate, walked me to the transport corridor, not roughly, with almost ceremonial care, the way you escort someone who has already lost. I let them. I walked out of the conclave's chamber and down the corridor and into the transport pod, and the whole time I kept that smile on my face, because I needed it to be real before I got home. I needed to believe it completely. And somewhere between Citadel Station and the perimeter relay that would take me back to Earth, alone in a transport pod with nothing but stars outside the viewport, and the hum of the drive beneath me, I stopped performing it. Because I did believe it. That was the thing. I genuinely believed it. We had just been handed the most dangerous gift in the history of our species. Absolute freedom. No more trade agreements to protect. No more diplomatic relationships to preserve. No more conclave oversight boards reviewing our research proposals and gently, firmly, consistently telling us which directions we were not permitted to explore. No more speed limiters on our drives. No more population review committees. No more ceilings. They thought they had punished us. They had no idea what they had done. I pressed my hand to the viewport glass, cold against my palm, and I looked out at the stars, our stars, every single one of them, and I let the smile come back, and this time it was completely, entirely real. Watch this, I said again, to no one, to everyone. The transport pod burned on toward home, and behind it, the conclave sealed the perimeter, and outside that perimeter, the most dangerous species in the galaxy started making plans. The first year was the worst. I will not pretend otherwise, because if I do, the rest of this story means nothing. You have to understand what it actually cost before you can understand what it actually became. The day the monitoring perimeter went live, 43 trade routes closed simultaneously. Supply chains that had been running on conclave relay infrastructure for 60 years simply stopped. Stations in the outer system that depended on those relay networks for communications went dark within 48 hours. The colony on Kepler 442b, a settlement of 12,000 people, second generation, children who had been born there, lost contact entirely. We did not hear from them for 11 months. Those 11 months were the longest of my life. I was back on Earth by then, in a small office in Geneva, where the new Terran Expansion Directorate had its temporary headquarters. Temporary meaning we had not yet figured out if we were going to survive long enough to need a permanent address. The Directorate was 7 people in a room, with too many screens and not enough coffee, trying to understand the full shape of what had just happened to us. It was enormous. The shape of it was enormous. We had not understood how deeply embedded we were in conclave infrastructure until it was gone. It was like discovering, the moment the power cut out, that every single thing in your house ran on electricity. The light, the heat, the water pump, the door locks, everything. Fuel synthesizers across the outer colonies relied on conclave-licensed catalyst compounds we could no longer import. Agricultural stations running on conclave format atmospheric processors began reporting system failures within 6 weeks. The economic contraction in the first year was the largest in human history, and I say that having lived through 3 of the 4 previous record holders. On Earth itself, the effects were slower but just as deep. The conclave had been our largest export market for rare element derivatives and biological compounds. When that closed, the ripple went through every sector. Unemployment climbed. The political fractures that the conclave hearings had partially papered over cracked, open again, wider than before. There were governments that blamed the Directorate. There were governments that blamed the explorers who had made contact with the Dravathi. There were governments that blamed humanity in general, as a philosophical position, which was not useful but was at least honest about the scale of the despair. I spent a lot of those months in closed meetings, explaining the same things over and over. The conclave is not coming back to negotiate. The perimeter is real. The trade routes are gone. No, I do not know when the Kepler colony will re-establish contact. Yes, I am certain we will find a way forward. No, I cannot prove that. I am asking you to believe it anyway. The hardest meeting I ever sat through was in month 4, when a delegation from the Martian settlement councils came to Geneva and sat down across from me and asked, very quietly, what I thought they should tell the parents of the children in the Kepler colony. I did not have a good answer. I had an honest answer, which was that I believed the colony was intact, because they were resourceful people in a well-built settlement and they had contingency protocols. But I could not prove it. I could only believe it. The delegation accepted that, which said more about them than about me. Something began to shift in month 6. It was not sudden. It did not arrive with fanfare. It was more like the way a tide turns. You cannot point to the exact moment it stops going out and starts coming in. But eventually you look up and the water is higher than it was. The shift came from the engineers. For 60 years, Terran scientists and engineers had worked under a framework of conclave-compliant research. This was not a law. Exactly. The conclave had no direct authority over our internal research programs, but it was a powerful incentive structure. Conclave trade access, relay network privileges, diplomatic standing. All of these things depended, in practice, on not developing technologies the conclave found threatening or destabilizing. There were no written rules. There did not need to be. Everyone understood which directions were acceptable, and which ones would generate a politely worded letter from a Vorathi trade attaché asking whether your research program had been properly reviewed. Those letters stopped, because there was no longer anything to threaten. We were already outside. There was no further out to send us. I remember the morning I received the first technical brief from Dr. Colin Marsh at the Lunar Institute. Colin was 51, thin, and had the focused energy of a person who had been waiting a very long time for the door to open. He had been working on a propulsion theory for 19 years, a method of transit that did not use the conclave's standard fold drive architecture but instead operated on a principle the conclave had officially classified as theoretically impossible in 2147. His brief ran to 400 pages. The cover sheet said simply, "They were wrong about this one." I read all 400 pages in a single sitting. I am not a physicist, but I understood enough to understand that if he was right, and his preliminary data suggested very strongly that he was, we had just solved this one technological problem that had kept us structurally dependent on conclave infrastructure. Their fold drive network was the skeleton of their power. Every species that used it needed them. Without it, interstellar travel took years. With it, days. The conclave controlled the architecture, the maintenance, the access codes. They could close a corridor the way a landlord changes a lock. Colin's drive did not use corridors, I called him. The connection was slow. The relay damage was still affecting long-range comms, but it went through. He answered on the second tone. He looked the way people look when they have been awake for 30 hours and are running on something better than sleep. "Dr. Marsh," I said, "tell me everything," he said immediately. "Funding, staff, the Tycho fabrication bays, and someone with the authority to tell the review board to stand aside." "You have all of those things," I said. "Starting now." He almost smiled. "And time? How much do you need?" He thought about it for a moment. 8 years, maybe 7 if the first trial goes well. "You have 6, I said. He did it in 5. But that is not what I want to tell you about. The drives, the reactors, the communications architecture, all of that came. What I want to tell you about is what happened to people during those years. Because the machines are not the real story. They never are. Something happened to humanity in the silence of the banishment years. Something quiet and deep and very difficult to explain to someone who was not there. We stopped performing. For 60 years, everything we did in space had an audience. Every research program was potentially a diplomatic talking point. Every cultural export was reviewed for compatibility with conclave sensitivities. Every mission was, to some degree, a message to someone watching. We had never been entirely ourselves, because we had never been entirely alone. Now we were alone. Completely, inescapably alone. And it turned out that being alone was something humans were surprisingly good at. The art that came out of the first decade of the banishment years is unlike anything before or after. Music that did not care whether a Vorathi ambassador would find it harmonically acceptable. Literature that did not soften itself for the diplomatic market. Visual art that drew from the oldest parts of the human imagination, the parts that had been politely filed away for 60 years of careful interstellar citizenship. It was raw and honest and sometimes very dark and sometimes ferociously funny, and it was completely, entirely human in a way that our output had not been in a generation. I found in those years that I could tell who had been born before the banishment and who had been born after it just by how they moved. The older ones, my generation, still carried a certain practiced care in public spaces, a habit of self-presentation we had developed for 60 years of being watched. The younger ones had no such habit. They were just themselves, entirely and without apology, and it was one of the most striking things I had ever witnessed. My colleague, a logistics coordinator named Paul Adler, put it better than I could. Paul was 26, born in the first year of the banishment, and he had never once in his life sent a diplomatic communication, or considered whether his research topic might generate a politely worded letter from a Vorathi trade attaché. I was explaining to him one evening in the directorate's break room what it had been like before, the self-censorship, the careful calibration, the performance of reassuring harmlessness. He looked at me for a long moment, then he said, "That sounds incredibly tiring." It was. I had not realized how tired I was until it stopped. By year 14, the Kepler colony had re-established contact. They were fine. Better than fine, isolated from the conclave disruption. They had spent 11 months solving their own problems, and the solutions they had come up with had given them a self-sufficiency rating that no outer colony had achieved before. They had not needed us to survive. They had needed us not to give up on them, which was a different thing. By year 18, the Tycho fabrication bays were producing components for something we were calling, internally, the well string, a communications architecture built on a quantum resonance principle so far outside the conclave's theoretical framework that we were not certain for the first 3 years of its development that it would work at all. It worked. It was instantaneous. It could not be jammed. It did not require relay stations. It required from the receiving end only a small resonance node the size of a fist. By year 20, we were quietly seeding those nodes into deep space. Nobody asked who they were for. Everyone understood who they were for. The Dravathi, and all the others like them. And that was when the banishment stopped being something that had happened to us and became something we had chosen, the long start, the deep breath before the real work began. I remember standing at the viewport of a transport barge in year 22, watching the outer asteroid belt slide past, this enormous field of rock and ice and frozen metal that we had spent 60 years treating as a scenic backdrop, and realizing that in the past 8 years we had quietly installed more infrastructure in that belt than the conclave had built across. 4-star systems in the same period. We had not announced it. There had been no press releases. The monitoring drones could see our light output, our radio emissions, our standard navigational transponders. They could see anything we did not want them to see. We had become, as a matter of survival, very good at not being seen. Paul Adler, now 38, and one of the lead logistics architects for what we were calling the network, stopped next to me at that viewport and looked out at the same field of rock. "You know what I keep thinking about," he said. "Tell me, when you stood up in that chamber and smiled, I've seen the recording probably 30 times. He paused. "What were you actually thinking?" I considered that for a moment. "I was thinking," I said, "that they had just made the worst mistake of their very long lives." He nodded slowly. "Were you sure?" "No," I said honestly. "But I needed to be sure enough to walk out without looking back. So I chose to be." He thought about that. "Is that what confidence is? Choosing to believe something before you can prove it?" "That," I said, "is exactly what it is." Outside, the belt drifted past, full of the structures we had built in the silence, in the dark. While no one was looking, we were almost ready. They left the monitoring drones in place for 30 years. I suppose they assumed that was enough time for us to collapse, or to beg, or both. The conclave's historical models, and they had very thorough historical models, 2,000 years of civilizational data, suggested that a Class 1 severance order produced one of 3 outcomes: rapid civilizational decline, fragmentation into non-spacefaring states, or a formal petition for reinstatement within 20 years. None of those things happened, but the drones could not tell them that. What the drones recorded was our light output, slightly reduced as we shifted to more efficient power systems. Our radio emissions, significantly reduced as we transitioned communications onto the wellstring, which operated on a frequency the drones could not detect. Our navigational transponder signals, present and accounted for, carefully maintained, broadcasting exactly what we wanted them to see. A quiet civilization, a diminished civilization, a civilization getting smaller. Inside the perimeter, we were doing the opposite of getting smaller. I want to tell you about the Tycho complex, because it is where the real work happened, and because almost no one outside the Directorate's inner circle knew it existed during those years. Tycho was a crater on the moon, the large, sharp-rimmed one visible from Earth with the naked eye on a clear night. The crater was well mapped, well documented, and completely uninteresting from the perspective of construction. It was exposed. It was prominent. It was exactly the kind of place no serious covert engineering program would ever be located. The Tycho complex was not in the crater. It was under it, beginning at 400 meters below the surface and extending, in a network of pressurized tunnels and fabrication chambers, for another 600 meters into the lunar mantle. The entrance was a maintenance access point for a solar array farm that had been operational since 2141. It appeared on every sensor array the monitoring drones possessed to be exactly what it said it was. Below it, 6,000 engineers, scientists, and fabrication technicians worked in 3 rotating shifts across a facility that covered more floor area than the city of Geneva. I visited it for the first time in year 19, and I want to be precise about what I felt when I stepped off the access lift and saw it for the first time because it matters. I had authorized it. I had read every briefing document about it. I had approved the budget allocations that funded it, and I still was not prepared. The main fabrication hall, just one of 11, was large enough that the far wall was slightly hazy with distance. The ceiling was 40 meters above the floor, and lined with full-spectrum lighting arrays that did an almost perfect job of mimicking noon sunlight. Along the floor, in ordered rows, were the assembly frames, each one holding a section of hull for one of the ships we were building. The ships were not small. The lead engineer for the hull program was a woman named Diane Carter, who had grown up in the Kepler colony and had been 14 years old during the 11 months of silence after the banishment. She was 41 when I first met her, and she had the calm, particular focus of someone who had decided exactly what they were going to spend their life doing and was in the middle of doing it. She showed me around the facility with the careful enthusiasm of a person who has been waiting a long time to show someone what they have been building. Not pride, exactly, or not just pride. Something closer to the feeling of finishing a very long sentence. "The drive assembly is through here," she said, and led me through a pressure door into a secondary chamber, where Colin Marsh's transit system was being integrated into the first production model, hull. Colin was there. He spent more time at Tycho than he spent anywhere else, and he nodded at me with the same expression he'd had in every meeting for the past 5 years, which was the expression of a man who found conversation a minor inconvenience compared to the work. "It fits?" I asked, because the drive housing had been one of the engineering problems that had consumed 3 months and 12 redesigns. "It fits," Diane said. "We had to reframe the aft section, but it fits. First full integration test is in 6 days. And the wellstring node integration?" Colin answered that one without looking up from the display he was reviewing. "Done. Done for 8 months. The hull nodes are the easy part." He paused. "The hard part was the outer system seating. That is also done." I looked at him. "How many?" 1,400 nodes, spread across the deep space approaches on the far side of the perimeter. If someone has a compatible receiver, someone small, outside the conclave's direct observation network, they can pick up wellstring traffic from anywhere in the outer spiral arm. Another pause. "We have already been receiving responses." That stopped me. "From whom?" He did reach for a secondary display then, pulling it up and turning it toward me. It showed a signal map, a web of faint lines connecting to points in deep space that I recognized as the approximate locations of several species the conclave cataloged as pre-contact civilizations. Pre-contact civilizations, in conclave terminology, meant species the conclave had found and then specifically chosen not to contact, which, as I had learned from the Dravathi situation, generally meant species the conclave found it more convenient to leave in ignorance. The wellstring did not care about conclave terminology. "How many?" I asked again. "Right now, definitively confirmed contact with 6 species. Probable contact with another 4. The signals are varied. Some are just return pings, automated system responses, probably from equipment they built after receiving our initial broadcast packets. But 3 of them are communicative, actual back and forth." He finally looked up at me. "One of them has been asking about the star charts." I sat down in a chair that happened to be nearby, because my legs made a decision I had not formally authorized. We had sent compressed data packets through the wellstring seeding network, a kind of message in a bottle, broadcast outward in the hope that someone would have the right kind of receiver to catch it. The packets had contained, among other things, star charts, real ones, complete ones, with no sections redacted or compressed into inaccuracy by diplomatic necessity. The same thing that had gotten us banished. We had done it on purpose this time. "What are they asking about the star charts?" I said. Colin's expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile but was the closest he usually got. "They want to know why certain systems that are marked as populated on our charts are marked as empty on the charts the conclave gave them 30 years ago and specifically," he continued, "the systems in the outer Keth corridor, which, as you know, the conclave has been quietly operating deep extract mining operations in since 2160. For a long moment, nobody in the chamber spoke. Then Diane said quietly, "They've been lied to about their own neighborhood." "Yes," I said, "for 30 years, almost certainly longer." She nodded slowly, the way someone does when a thing they suspected is confirmed, and they wish, just slightly, that they had been wrong. "What do we do?" she asked. I thought about that for a moment. I thought about a chamber on Citadel Station. I thought about 6 half-closed eyes and the hum of ratification. I thought about the star charts we had accidentally given to the Dravathi and the cascade of consequences that had followed. I thought about the fact that we had done it again, deliberately, and I had no regrets. "We answer their question," I said, honestly, with full documentation. And then we wait. Because that is what the truth does, it waits, and eventually, it finds every door. The integration test on the first ship ran 6 days later. It worked. Not perfectly. There were calibration issues with the aft node synchronization that took another 3 weeks to resolve. But the drive fired, and the ship moved, and the distance it covered in the first test jump was, according to Colin's instruments, which he checked 4 times before he said the number out loud. 17 light minutes in 0.003 seconds. The conclave's most advanced fold drive achieved a comparable distance in 11 minutes. Colin stood at the readout display for a long time, not saying anything. Then he turned to the room. And I want to tell you that he made a speech because the moment deserved one, but he did not. He said, "Run it again." They ran it 11 more times that day. I sat in the observation alcove above the fabrication floor and watched the data come in from each test, and after the 8th run I called Paul Adler, who was coordinating the outer system network infrastructure from a station in the Kuiper Belt. "The drives work," I said. A pause. "Then how well?" "Well enough." Another pause. "How many ships can we have ready in 2 years?" I looked down at the fabrication floor, at the 11 assembly frames, at the 6,000 people working in 3 shifts, at the tunnels branching beyond the main hall that I had not yet fully explored. "More than they will be expecting," I said. "Good," Paul said. "Because I have been having conversations with some people out here that I think you need to hear about. People who are very interested in the Wellstring. People who have some questions about star charts. The Dravathi, among others," he said. "Asha, there are more of them than we knew. A lot more. And some of them have been waiting a very long time for someone to answer a signal they sent, out about 15 years ago." Outside the observation alcove in the long chamber below, Diane Carter was walking the length of the assembly floor, checking each frame in turn, her hand resting briefly on each hull section as she passed it. "The way you touch something you built that is almost ready." "Tell them we are coming," I said. "I already did," said Paul. The Dravathi called their home system HFY, which translated roughly as the center of things. Not with arrogance, but with the practical orientation of a species that had named their world before they knew other worlds existed. Most species did the same. The Varathi called their planet something that translated as the ground. We called ours Earth. The instinct to make yourself the center of your own map was apparently a universal one. HFY was 4 light years past what had once been the Conclave's monitoring perimeter. The perimeter that we had, over the previous 18 months, quietly removed, not destroyed. Removed piece by piece, storing the Sentinel drones in the outer Kuiper Belt for reasons that would become apparent later. The fleet we brought to HFY was not, by any conventional military measure, a battle fleet. There were no weapons platforms in the configuration the Conclave would have recognized as such. What there was instead was the Tiaz Unshackled, the Terran exploration ship, which was the first production vessel from the Tycho fabrication program, hull registration 1, named at a staff vote that had gone 17 different directions before landing on the obvious answer. Along with 8 cargo-class vessels and 4 fast transit scouts, the cargo ships were full of Wellstring nodes, reactor components, medical fabricators, agricultural system cores, educational archives, and star charts, real ones, complete ones, for anyone who wanted them. Second in command on the Unshackled was a man named Oliver Grant, who had been a deep space surveyor before the banishment and had spent the intervening 30 years moving between the Directorate's logistics division and the outer system infrastructure team with the quiet efficiency of someone who found administration genuinely satisfying. He was 55, had 4 adult children born in the banishment years, and had a habit of stopping in the middle of corridors to read something on his datapad with the same focused expression most people reserved for meals. He was reading when we dropped out of transit 6,000 kilometers from HFY because the transit itself took 0.04 seconds and did not require supervision. He looked up at the main viewport, at the pale yellow star centered in it, at the second planet glowing in the reflected light. He said. Yes, I agreed. The Dravathi had been warned we were coming. We had sent the arrival time and coordinates 3 days in advance through the Wellstring, and the response had come back within 6 hours. A set of orbital coordinates for a meeting point, and a single additional line that our translation system rendered as, "We have been ready for this." I spent a lot of time wondering what they meant by that. Ready for contact? Ready for trade? Ready to ask the questions about the star charts? All of those things, it turned out, and one more. Their representative met us in open space, in a vessel so small it was barely visible against the planet's disk, till it was close enough for the hull cameras to pick up clearly. It was a single-occupancy scout, ancient by our sensor read, patched and repatched in ways that suggested a civilization that maintained its equipment very carefully for a very long time. A civilization, in other words, that did not have easy access to replacement parts. Their name was something our translation system rendered as a long sequence of tonal markers, so they told us to call them Voss, after their world's name. They were roughly humanoid, 2 main limbs, 2 secondary limbs, a bilateral face, and they wore a suit that was clearly environmental rather than vacuum-rated, which meant they had assumed correctly that we would be able to pressurize a meeting space. I met them in the small reception compartment off the main airlock. Oliver stood beside me. 2 crew members, both of them from Paul's outer system team, were present with translation tablets. Voss came through the lock, looked at me, looked at Oliver, and then looked around the compartment with the careful attention of someone memorizing details. Then they said something that the translation system took 4 seconds to process. When it came back, it read, "We sent a signal 16 years ago. We did not expect it to take this long for someone to answer." I had read about that signal. It had been one of the broad-spectrum transmissions, what some of our astronomers had classified as attempt contact, no recipient specified, that had been sitting in our long-range reception archive, unread, since before the banishment. We had found it when we were cataloging the archive for well-string compatibility 8 years ago. "We're sorry it took so long," I said. Voss tilted their head in a way that the translation notation marked as neither acceptance nor rejection, simply acknowledgement. "The conclave told us," they said, "that the signal had been received and evaluated, and that no response was warranted because we did not meet the threshold for formal contact." "Silence. The conclave," I said carefully, "never forwarded that signal to us." Another tilt. "We assumed as much." Eventually, Oliver made a sound very low in his throat. I did not look at him. "We have star charts for you," I said. "Complete ones. And we have some questions, if you're willing, about the outer Keth corridor." "We have answers," Voss said. "We have had answers for a long time. We were not sure anyone was going to come and ask. We talked for 6 hours. Voss, it emerged, was not a formal diplomat. The Dravathi did not have a diplomatic corps in the way the conclave defined one, because the conclave had told them 30 years ago that there was no one outside their system worth diplomatically engaging with. Voss was an engineer. Specifically, they were the person who had built the signal transmitter that sent the 16-year-old message. They had come to meet us because they built the transmitter. By hour 3, we were on a first-name basis, and Oliver had acquired, from somewhere in the unshackled stores, a thermos of tea, which Voss approached with the careful scientific interest they applied to everything. By hour 5, we had moved from star charts to logistics, what the Dravathi needed, what we could supply, what the mechanics of a well-string node installation looked like. By hour 6, we had reached the question that had been sitting under all the others. "What do you want from us?" Voss asked. "Not suspicious, genuinely curious. A way station site," I said. "Somewhere we can establish a fixed point in your system, and trade. Whatever you have that you want to trade. And in exchange? Everything in those cargo ships, and a seat at a table we're building." Voss looked at me for a long moment. "What kind of table?" "The kind," I said, "where no one gets to tell you your neighborhood is empty when it isn't." The agreement took 6 hours to reach and about 40 minutes to formalize. It was the fastest diplomatic resolution in Terran history, and I was later told it was the fastest diplomatic resolution in Dravathi history. But since the Dravathi's diplomatic history had been largely managed by the conclave for 3 decades, that particular comparison had some caveats. What happened next happened faster than anyone on our side had modeled, and faster than anyone on the conclave side could have imagined, because neither of us had understood the scale of what was out there. In the 6 months following the AF-COS agreement, we made formal contact with 8 more species. They were not hard to find. They found us, through the Wellstring nodes, through signals forwarded by the Dravathi, through broadcasts that had apparently been traveling toward us for years, and were finally, now that we were outside the perimeter and listening properly, reaching their destinations. Every single one of them had a story about the conclave. Every single story had the same shape. A species is found, a species is cataloged, a species is told that the rest of the galaxy is either too advanced for contact, or too underdeveloped to bother with, or simply empty, depending on which lie was most useful. A species is quietly integrated into a resource extraction system, or kept isolated as a buffer zone, or simply left to stagnate as the conclave manages the approaches to their system for its own transit convenience. Every single one of them had been waiting, not for us specifically, just for someone, for anyone who would show up and say, "The map you were given is wrong. The neighborhood is full. You were lied to, and we are not here to replace one set of keepers with another." We meant that last part. It was the most important part. We had been kept, and we knew what it felt like, and we had no interest in doing it to anyone else. The network we were building was not a new conclave. It had no thresholds for contact, no population review committees, no approved research directions. It had one rule which Paul Adler drafted and which everyone who joined signed. No species in the network would be kept from information about their own neighborhood. That was it. One rule. Everything else was negotiable. By the end of year 2 outside the perimeter, 29 species had joined the network. By the end of year 3, the number was 41. The Wellstring carried more traffic in a single day than the Conclave's relay network had carried in a month. The Conclave's monitoring drones, still parked faithfully at the perimeter boundary, continued to record our light output, which remained carefully stable, which remained, to their instruments, exactly what it had been for 30 years, the light of a quiet, diminished civilization. They did not know that inside the space they were watching, a different kind of civilization had grown up. They did not know about the Tycho complex, or the network, or the 41 species, or the 16 species outside the perimeter who were having very loud internal conversations about their own conclave relationships in the wake of seeing some star charts that showed their neighborhood was not actually empty. They did not know any of it until we sent them a message. 3 words. See us. Seth Ka came himself. I had thought they might send a junior delegation, a diplomatic courtesy visit framed as routine monitoring. That was the kind of thing the conclave excelled at, treating consequential things as routine, to maintain the impression that everything was proceeding as expected. But Seth Ka came, which told me that the anomalies the monitoring drones had been recording, the things that did not quite add up, the signals that almost resolved into something alarming before going quiet, had been alarming enough that the elder himself felt he needed to see it in person. He arrived in the conclave's standard diplomatic vessel, a large heavy cruiser built for presence rather than speed, with the conclave seal prominent on the hull, and a full complement of the sensor arrays that made it, by conclave standards, a very sophisticated observer. It crossed into the space where the perimeter had been, and its sensors immediately began their standard assessment, sweep. I watched the sweep on our instruments from the bridge of the Unshackled. Oliver stood beside me. Paul had come in from the outer system network hub for this. He was standing on my other side, arms folded, with the expression of someone who is trying very hard to remain calm and is succeeding. The conclave ship's sweep ran into its first problem within 30 seconds. The space where the monitoring drones had been was empty. Not destroyed. We had not destroyed them. We had boxed them, labeled them carefully, and sent them back to the perimeter boundary in automated cargo pods, with a handwritten note attached to the lead pod's external message clip. The note read, in standard conclave script, "You will want thee back." The conclave ship scanned the cargo pods, identified the drone hardware, scanned the note. There was a long pause in their sensor sweep while someone on that ship presumably had a conversation about what this meant. Then they continued the sweep, and the second problem arrived. 17 settled bodies. The conclave's records showed 1 inhabited planet and 8 stations in this sector. Their sensors were now showing 17 settled bodies, 4 of them at population levels that exceeded the conclave's definition of a developed civilization. They showed transit beacon networks on frequencies their system did not recognize. They showed infrastructure in the asteroid belt that had not existed 30 years ago, and that their instruments could not classify, because we had built it to specifications the conclave's sensor architecture was not calibrated to detect. Then they tried to scan the Unshackled. The Unshackled's hull was coated in a material Diane Carter had developed in year 18 of the banishment. Using a combination of principles from 3 different research directions the conclave had classified as theoretically unproductive. It was not invisible. You could see the ship. You could measure its mass, its rough dimensions, its position. What you could not do was get a detailed sensor read of its interior configuration, its drive signature, its weapons systems, or its energy output. To a conclave sensor array, the Unshackled returned exactly the kind of data you would expect from a very large object that was not cooperating with your scan. The communication request came 4 minutes after the sweep began. I answered it immediately. Seth Ka's face appeared on the main screen. 60 years older than I remembered. The Varathi aged slowly, but they aged. But the same careful expression. The 6 eyes still carrying that quality of looking at something without entirely registering it. The expression of someone who was very good at managing their own surprise. "Commander Vale," he said. "Elder Seth Ka," I said. "It has been a long time." "Yes." He looked past me for a moment, and I knew he was looking at whatever data his bridge was still trying to pull from the space around us. Then his gaze came back to mine. "We received your message." "I know, I sent it. Come see us." Those were the words. They were. Another pause. He was regrouping. I could see it. The Varathi were not visibly emotional in the way humans were. But Seth Ka's 6 eyes were doing something I had never seen them do in 3 years of hearings, which was moving independently of each other, each one looking at a slightly different portion of my face. It was, I gathered, the Varathi equivalent of searching for something. "We would like," he said carefully, "to discuss the terms of the severance order." "The terms," I said. "What about them?" "There are mechanisms," he said, "within the order's framework for a formal petition of reinstatement. The process requires a—" "Elder," I said. He stopped. We are not petitioning for reinstatement. Silence, full complete, the same silence he had used in that chamber 30 years ago. But this time it was his. I see, he said after a moment. Then what is it you want? I thought about that question. I thought about all the versions of it I had been asked, across 30 years, in Geneva and on Luna, and in pressurized compartments in deep space, and in the small hours of long nights when I had asked it of myself. What do you want? What is this for? Where does it go? I knew the answer. I had always known it. It had been in the smile I gave him in that chamber. Even then, even before I could prove it. Nothing from you, I said. We don't need anything from you. His eyes steadied. Then why did you contact us? Courtesy, I said, and information. You should know what you are looking at. I nodded to Paul, who had been standing just outside the camera's view. He brought up the network display on a secondary screen and transferred it to the outgoing video feed so Sethka could see it. The full map, all 41 species, the wellstring coverage, the infrastructure web, the trade volumes. Sethka looked at it for a long time. I watched him look at it. I watched the six eyes process it. I thought about the Drevithi engineer who had built a transmitter and sent a signal and waited 16 years for an answer. I thought about the species in the outer Keth corridor, who had been told their neighborhood was empty. I thought about Paul's father, who had been in the first class of deep space pilots and had retired before the banishment with a conclave citation for responsible conduct in unexplored space. I thought about Diane Carter, 14 years old in a silent colony, and what she had built in the 37 years since. I thought about Colin Marsh, who had been right about a thing the conclave said was impossible, and who was at this moment probably in the Tycho complex, running his 200-and-something fifth drive test and not caring at all about this conversation. I thought about the monitoring drones, boxed up in cargo pods, labeled carefully and returned in good condition. I thought about a courtroom and 6 half-closed eyes, and the specific quality of silence that follows a verdict. This is what you built, Sethka said. It was not quite a question. This is what you gave us the freedom to build, I said, when you removed every ceiling. He looked at the map for another long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not smaller, exactly, but differently calibrated. The tone of someone who is recalculating. You said nothing you need from us, he said, but I will ask again. Is there nothing, no arrangement, no acknowledgement, no integration of what you have built into the larger structure of galactic governance that you would consider? I let the question sit for a moment, because the truth was I had thought about this. We all had. We had talked about it in the directorate, in the outer system stations, in the hallways of the Tycho complex. We had debated it at length, and we had come to a clear answer. If any species in the conclave, I said, wants to voluntarily join the network as equals under our one rule, no ceilings and no kept neighborhoods, we will welcome that conversation. We will welcome it with both hands. I paused. But the conclave itself is not in a position to offer us something we do not already have. We have more transit coverage than your relay network. We have faster ships. We have more members than your inner council. And we have something you have never managed to build in 2,000 years of trying. What's that, he asked. Trust, I said. The species in this network are here because they chose to be, not because they were managed into compliance, or left with no better option, or told that we were the only game in the galaxy. They are here because we answered their signals, because we showed them real maps, because we told them the truth about their neighborhoods, even when the truth was uncomfortable. I looked at him directly, the same way I had looked at him across the void of the conclave chamber 30 years ago. You cannot replicate that with a framework document. The silence was different this time. It was not the silence of a verdict. It was the silence of a man realizing for the first time that the game he thought he was playing had a different board than the one he was looking at. I will, Sethka said. Need to report this to the full council. I expected as much, I said. Take as long as you need. And if the council requests further dialogue, then request it through the wellstring, I said. Oliver will send you the node specifications. From just off camera, Oliver said. Already drafted the package. Sethka looked at me for one more moment. Then, with a formality that I could not quite read, not entirely defeat, not entirely the old performance of authority, something genuinely in between, he said. You have changed things, Commander Vale. No, I said. We just stopped letting you keep them the same. He closed the channel. On the bridge of the Unshackled, nobody moved for a few seconds. Then Paul exhaled slowly, the long, careful breath of someone who has been holding it without entirely realizing. Oliver set his datapad down on the console beside him and looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. Associate membership forms, he said. I had said it as a closing line to Sethka, almost reflexively, and I had half expected Paul to look at me sideways for it. But Paul was grinning, and Oliver, who did not grin often, was clearly trying not to. Draft them, I said. Just in case. I turned to the viewport. Seth Ka's ship was already beginning its orientation for departure. A slow, careful turn that looked, from this angle, like a very dignified retreat. I watched it go. I had spent 30 years carrying the weight of that moment in the conclave chamber. The ruling, the silence, the walkout. I had told people it didn't bother me, I had mostly meant it. But I understood, watching that ship turn, that I had also been holding something I did not entirely know I was holding. A long-held breath of my own. It came out slowly, quietly, without drama. Paul came to stand beside me at the viewport. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the same thing I was looking at. "Was it what you expected?" he asked. "More or less," I said. "I expected him to be smaller." "He wasn't that small." "No," I agreed. "But smaller than he was 30 years ago." I paused, which is how it should work. People who stop growing get smaller by comparison, even when they don't move. Paul nodded then. "What do we do now?" The ship on the viewport had completed its turn and was accelerating away, back toward the space it had come from, back toward a conclave that was going to have a very difficult internal conversation in the coming weeks. "Now," I said. I thought about the 16 species still in active first contact conversations through the wellstring. I thought about the 3 outer system fabrication sites that were completing their second production run. I thought about the Drevathi engineer who had built a transmitter and the Kepler colony that had survived 11 months of silence and come out stronger, and the engineering teams in the asteroid belt running drive tests in the cold, and the 6,000 people in the Tycho complex working 3 shifts to build the things that made all of this possible. I thought about a courtroom 30 years ago and the specific sound of a gavel sealing an order that was supposed to be the end of something. It had been the beginning. "Now," I said, "we get back to work." Oliver picked up his datapad. Paul turned away from the viewport. Around us, the bridge returned to its quiet, efficient movement. People doing the 10,000 small tasks that kept a ship moving and a network expanding and a civilization being exactly what it had always, underneath everything, been capable of being. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars they had always been. They were just, at last, entirely ours.